My name is Cynthia Robbins. I am co-leader and co-founder of the Racial Justice Initiative, and we consider this an extraordinary and important event in closing the school-to-prison pipeline. We have for you tonight some extraordinary witnesses who are going to share with you data, stories, information, and strategies.
The reality is that millions of students of color, especially males and students with disabilities across the country, are subjected to exclusionary disciplinary practices that fracture their education, obstruct further educational and employment opportunity, and ultimately steer them, at least indirectly, into the criminal justice system.
I'm pleased that Dr. Khan has used the word discrimination, because some may say, what are you talking about discrimination? They've got black teachers and black elected officials and black students. Well, if that's all it took, then why are so many of our children out on the street unable to go to school? And why are we unable to come forward ourselves with better alternatives than we have done?
So if you really want to make a change, then bring together all the decision makers with all the advocates in forums like this, the Dean Khan, in order to look at the disproportionality. And you can't believe the kind of change systems that could take place with your energy and your effort.
A student was suspended for talking on the cell phone at Metropolitan High School. Keep in mind the regulations don't allow for a suspension in this case. This is a tier 1 or tier 2 violation. You heard some folks talk about the tiers in DCPS. What happened with this student is they just flatly refused his admission into the school for 4 weeks.
Another client, Latoya, is an energetic 7th grader who likes school and has excellent attendance. Earlier this year, she took her teacher's cell phone off her desk. She knew it was wrong, and the next day she admitted her mistake, returned it, and apologized. Unfortunately, even though her behavior didn't create any safety concern and was not disruptive to the learning of other students, the school still chose to try and suspend her for the longest possible suspension the law permits, 90 days.
In one particularly startling case, DCPS had proposed a 5-week out-of-school suspension for a middle schooler. And when this case was reviewed by an independent hearing officer, what they found is that the only punishment the student should have received was a verbal reprimand. So for example, in January and February of 2012, in 66% of cases, individualized hearing officers looked at the cases that DCPS were proposing for suspension and expulsion and said that what DCPS was proposing was not correct and was too excessive. So in 66% of cases, they kicked back the suspensions and expulsions for DC's kids.
School sanctions, such as suspensions and expulsions, increase the chances a student will be involved in the justice system in the future. And as was also stated, kids become alienated from school when they're kicked out of school. You don't let a kid come to school, you tell him he doesn't belong in school, guess what? He believes you. In addition, there's also an increased likelihood of dropping out.
What we know is there is little accountability and suspension of less than 11 days. Over 62% of the cases we have seen involve suspensions of 10 days or less. They are, by definition, for situations that are not egregious or where no actual harm has occurred, and they are not appropriate. We had a DCPS middle school who was accused of horseplaying in the building after hours, and he lost a total of 8 days of instructional time. We have a DCPS high school student who was suspended because he was roaming the hallways when he was supposed to be in class, and for that he lost a total of 10 days of instructional time.
Like many other students, as a result of this struggling, Joe started cutting classes. So he and I sat down and we agreed that I'd take him to school one day to make sure he got there and to speak with school officials about extra help that he could get to get him back on track. I was shocked and appalled by what I saw and experienced. Immediately upon walking Joe into the front office, the staff was hostile and disrespectful to him. Before Joe even opened his mouth, the staff person turned to me and said, "I can already tell Joe is not ready to learn today," and asked Joe for his school ID card. When Joe could not produce his school ID card, the staff person told Joe that he would have to go immediately to in-school suspension for the day for not having his ID card.
We began to assess the chronically disruptive kids instead of suspending them, asking the question, why are you chronically disruptive, instead of just punishing them. I mean, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would promote graduation rates?
During my brief testimony, I want to highlight two particularly disturbing trends we see in our cases. First, that students with disabilities are frequently being pushed out of school rather than given appropriate services. And secondly, that suspension and expulsion are being used inappropriately with very young children. National research shows that schools exclude students with disabilities, particularly those with emotional and behavioral disorders, at disproportionately higher rates. We have seen this trend in DC public and charter schools as well. 5-year-old Daryl has been diagnosed with autism. He's been suspended from school 3 times due to tantrums and oppositional behavior. Quite normal behaviors for a young child with autism. Another elementary school student, 8-year-old Michael, was suspended for dancing inappropriately. The school alleged that his dancing amounted to sexual harassment of a teacher's aide. The school actually called the police on this 8-year-old. Luckily, the police didn't arrest him, but the child was still excluded from school for 3 days. Recently, 4-year-old Malik was suspended for 3 days from his charter school for kicking off his shoes and crying in frustration. After further incidents involving Malik fighting with a classmate over a toy, the school threatened to expel him until my colleague began representing the family. 4-year-olds don't have the ability to comprehend suspensions. This little boy had no idea why he wasn't allowed to go back to school.
As with educational attainment, wards 7 and 8 are the most impacted by school suspension and expulsion, accounting for over half of all students expelled or suspended for extended periods. In 2010 up to the 2011 school year, 37% of students in Ward 8 were expelled or suspended for more than 11 days. 37%. In Ward 7, the figure is almost 1 in 5. By contrast, no student, statistically 0%, in Ward 2, and only 3 in 100 students in Ward 3 were expelled or suspended for more than 11 days.
What it says to me is that the system is broken, and that the system needs to be studied and fixed. One student got 10 days for fighting, the next student got 1 day. One student got the suspension packet, another never received the suspension packet. One parent was called in for conference, another never was called in for conference. So that the inconsistency is just frightening. It says to me that the system is broken, and that individual schools deciding on what disciplinary action they will take and what's appropriate for them.
What we need is a moratorium on suspending and expelling kids. The standard for kicking a kid out of school should be consistent and the same as the standard that under law legitimately allows for a civil commitment because of danger to self or danger to others, or parallel, preventive detention in a delinquency case. That is a very high standard. It's the only rational justification for pushing a kid out of school when we know what works, and we know definitively that pushing kids out of school doesn't work. The Texas study said 3 things. If you kick a kid out of school, controlling for all these variables, that kid is more likely to repeat a grade. If you kick a kid out of school, that kid is more likely not to complete school. And third, if you kick a kid out of school, again, controlling for all variables, that kid is more likely to end up in the delinquency system. It's proven definitively. We can't tolerate anything other than a moratorium that equates the standard for pushing a kid out of school with preventive detention or civil commitment. Thanks.
But of all people, educators should know that. And that's what bothered me the most. Because educators are not dumb people. They're educators, they're very smart. But the problem is they're caught up in a system. And it's a broken system. And we have a lot of good people in this system. But it's a broken system that's causing good people to make bad decisions that hurt kids.